Hi and welcome back to the course. In this video, we are finally going to get started using SQLAlchemy. Now, SQLAlchemy is going to make a lot of things a lot easier, but it does require a couple of minutes setting it up. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new file that is going to host our SQLAlchemy object. So let's create a new file in the base code folder, so not inside the models folder or anywhere else. And I'm going to call it db.py. You can call it whatever you want, but I'm going to go for db. And what we're going to do here is we're going to import the SQLAlchemy object. So from Flask-SQLAlchemy, we're going to import SQLAlchemy. And I'm going to initialize a variable called db to be SQLAlchemy. Now let me explain what's going on here. We've got a object, which is SQLAlchemy, and that is essentially a thing that is going to link to our app, our Flask app, and it's going to look at all of the objects that we tell it to, and then it's going to allow us to map those objects to rows in a database. For example, it will allow us to do something like when we create an item model object that has a column called name and a column called price, it's going to allow us to very easily put that object into our database. Naturally, putting an object into a database, all that is saving the object's properties into the database, and that's what SQLAlchemy excels at, and it makes things really easy. It sounds like something not very useful, but you'll see how simpler it makes our code. Now that we've created the db variable, we're going to go over to the app.py and we're going to import it to make sure that we can use it. Now, normally we import things at the top, but in this specific scenario, we're going to import the db variable down here inside the if statement. So we're going to do from db import db, and then we're going to do db.init app. And the app we're going to pass in is our Flask app. Now, why are we importing this here? Well, it's because of a thing called circular imports. Our item models and things are going to import db as well. So if we import db at the top, and we're also going to import the models at the top, when we import the model is going to import the db, and the db is going to be here in app, and then it's going to create a circular import. I'll explain in a moment once we've finalized setting things up why it wouldn't work. But in order for us to proceed, we have to make our models extend this db that we've got going on there. So what we're going to do is we're going to import the db, and then both the user and the item model are going to extend db.model. And what that's going to do is it's going to tell the SQLAlchemy entity that these classes here, this item model and the user model that we're about to make it extend as well, are things that we are going to be saving to a database and retrieving from a database. So it's going to create that mapping between the database and these objects. Okay, so all we've done is we've imported the db variable from the db file, and then we've made the classes extend db model in both cases, item model and user model. The next thing we have to do is tell SQLAlchemy the table name where these models are going to be stored. So as we see in our queries, we're accessing the users table, so that's the table we're going to be using. And the way we tell SQLAlchemy is we create a new variable called __ table name __, and we make that equal to users, which is a table. And we also have to tell it what columns the table contains, or what columns we want the table to contain. In this case, the user has an ID, which is going to be db.column, db.integer, primary _ key equals true. So all we're doing here is we're telling SQLAlchemy that there is a column called ID, and that's of type integer, and that's the primary key. Remember, the primary key, all that means is that this is unique, and it's going to create an index based on it. We've not looked at indexes yet, but essentially all that makes it makes it easy to search based on ID. The next thing we're going to have is the username, which is also going to be a column, but this time it's going to be a string. And now we can optionally put here something like 80 in order to limit the size of the username, to make it 80 characters maximum. And it's usually a good idea to put limitations in your columns. Don't be too limiting with your sizes, but also don't allow any sizes or else some users might go mental. And also a password. Like so. So now what we've done is we've told SQLAlchemy the 3 columns that this model is going to have, and when it comes to saving it to the database, it's only going to look for these 3 properties. And as you can see, ID, username, and password must match or rather the other way around. These properties, self.id, self.username, self.password, must match the columns for them to be saved to the database. We can have other properties, and this property won't be saved to the database, and it also won't give us an error. It will exist in the object, but it won't be in any way related to the database. It won't be stored, it won't be read from the database. Okay. Now let's do the same thing with the item. We have to specify the table name, which is items, and we also have to specify the columns. In this case, the ID column doesn't exist for our items. Our items have never used IDs, but we're going to start doing that because having an ID for each entity is usually very useful, as we'll learn in the later stages of this section. So once again, the process is db.column to tell it that we want a column, then we tell it the data type, db.integer, and finally we say if we want it to be a foreign key or not, which we do because this is the not the foreign key, primary key. Apologies. Don't know what I'm thinking about. Did I say foreign key here? No, I said primary key. Okay, a primary key. Yeah, the foreign key is something else, and we'll look at foreign keys very soon. And then, of course, the name. It would help if I can type. And the price, which is going to be another column. But in this case, it is going to be a float. And we can also specify a precision. That's the number of numbers after the decimal point. And currencies are always to 2 decimal places. Actually, most of the time to 2 decimal places. So we're going to stick with precision 2. And all that does is it says this column is a floating point number. A decimal number. Okay. Now the last thing that we have to do as well is in our app, we have to go ahead and make sure that we specify a configuration property, which is app.config SQLAlchemy _track _modifications is going to be false. So the reason why we say this is slightly more advanced, but essentially, in order to know when an object had changed but not been saved to the database, the extension Flask-SQLAlchemy was tracking every change that we made to the SQLAlchemy session, and that took some resources. Now we're turning it off because SQLAlchemy itself, the main library, has its own modification tracker, which is a bit better. So this turns off the Flask-SQLAlchemy modification tracker. It does not turn off the SQLAlchemy modification tracker. So this is only changing the extension's behaviors and not the underlying SQLAlchemy behavior. Okay. And that's everything. All that we've done now is we have told our app that we have 2 models that are coming from tables in our database, the users table and the items table, and we've told SQLAlchemy how it can read these items by just looking at the columns And when it does look at the columns, it's going to see the name and the price, and it's going to pump them in straight to the init method, and it's going to be able to create an object for each row in our database. The ID method will also be passed in, but because there's no ID parameter here, it won't be used. Okay? And that's it, really. But, of course, we still haven't used SQLAlchemy in any of our methods. These are still going straight through to the to the SQLite database. So these are not using SQLAlchemy at all. We're going to be working on that in the next video. For now, I'd encourage you to try all of this with Postman to make sure it works, and then move on to the next video. So I'll see you there.